There are roughly 750,000 Russian troops in and around Ukraine. The southern portion of the country, which is heavily Russian in terms of population, history, and so forth, has been successfully defended now for, 6-8 months against numerous offensives and counterattacks designed to drive the Russians out. Now, why did the Russians opt in the fall of last year for a defensive posture? Well, precisely because they recognized the force they'd sent in was too small for the job. They didn't even understand the job when they went in there. Now they know they've got to crush the Ukrainian armed forces out of existence for all intents and purposes. And they have to compel the Ukrainians to come to the negotiating table. They realize that may take everything from another month to another 2 years, depending upon how far and how fast they want to move. We keep telling them that nothing's acceptable until they agree to commit suicide publicly, pull out of eastern Ukraine, and beg for forgiveness. Well, since that's not going to happen, the Russians are continuing to quietly mobilize more reserves, with the goal of ultimately building a force of 1.2 million. That force would ultimately go all the way to the Polish border. But I think for the moment, what they're looking at in August and September is now going over to the offensive. In fact, that's already begun in the northeastern portion of Ukraine, along an axis that reaches from Beograd in Russia all the way to Limon and Slavyansk, and potentially could end up with the encirclement of Kharkov, at which point in time, I suppose the Russians will invite the Ukrainians to hurl their final reserves at them in the defensive positions around Kharkov, which will result in their annihilation. And then at some point, Russia will cross the river and take Odessa. And again, they will pause and they will wait to see if there's anyone willing to talk with them. And if there isn't, well, then they'll continue to move. Everything is very deliberate. This is not a rushed operation by any means. They move within the framework of their integrated air defenses, which effectively neutralize air power and protect their forces from the range of missiles and drones and rockets that are out there. And then you also have the necessity of moving their strike systems, their ground-based strike systems, further forward as their troops advance. This all takes time, so it's a very deliberate operation, very carefully planned and executed. And thus far, it's proven to be unstoppable by the Ukrainians. And I think we're seeing that right now with this offensive.
No, I think the Russians have seen this as a challenge, given that, they now have Wagner's in Belarus and also sent nuclear weapons to Belarus. So I think they're trying to hedge against this prospect of the war spreading. But I guess I share your concern about the escalation of the conflict, because initially we were told even sending tanks would be too much of a dangerous escalation. Yet this is a long time ago. We crossed this line, long distance weapons, many other red lines we weren't supposed to cross. Now we're sending depleted uranium ammunition, cluster ammunition, possibly F-16. So it feels like we'll keep looking for these silver bullets, something, a game changer, something that can turn the tide. But if you're correct now, and Ukraine is moving towards collapse, there must be immense pressure
providing these convoys for Ukrainian grain, which would be, a way for NATO to get involved directly into this war. I just, do you see I'm thinking with the Black Sea option now, do you think, your opening question, what about NATO over the long run? And I think NATO is doomed because NATO consists of, 32 nations now? Every nation has a different set of interests. Not all of those nations see the world through the same lens as people in Washington, Brussels, Berlin, or Oslo. In other words, the world looks very different depending upon where you stand. Trying to drag NATO into this could absolutely end it quickly, and I don't think Washington believes that. I think, again, they look at the sheepish behavior of the ruling elites in Europe and say, well, these people have no choice, but they have to go along with this anyway. Well, perhaps that's true for the globalists that are running your countries, but that's not necessarily true for the people that live in Europe. And I think the European electorate see things differently. In other words, Putin remains cautious because he does not want to precipitate a direct confrontation with NATO and the United States. That's always been his top concern. But I think he's got plenty of senior officers who are telling him, look, if we continue to wait this way, people will misinterpret our restraint for weakness and they will think that they can exploit this weakness. And I think the senior officers in the senior ranks of the Russian military who are saying that are correct. You cannot win any war by sitting on the defensive. It can't be done. You can kill almost everybody in front of you, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can win. And I think increasingly the view in the senior ranks of the Russian side is that until we're moving down the main streets of Kyiv and our forces have crossed the Dnipro River, no one is going to believe the war is really over. In other words, they won't believe that we've won it. I think there's a lot of truth to that. So the danger right now is too much Russian restraint. And if it continues, I think it will invite Polish and Lithuanian intervention. And then that is Pandora's box. God help all of us. The Russians have also, I think Putin deserves a lot of credit for this, have also been very sensitive to the opinions of people in the global south. Not just China and India, but also the global south. And he has not wanted them to think that he was someone who would dismiss the humanitarian dimensions of the war. And he hasn't. In other words, he's tried to make it very clear that his approach to this whole thing is more defensive than offensive. That this is something Russia doesn't want, has never really wanted, and is doing because it had no alternative. But at the same time, this is interpreted in the West as weakness. And I think the Russians know that. And I have a feeling that they're waiting to see what the Poles and Lithuanians do. And if they are foolish enough to intervene, I suspect at that point, the great avalanche of Russian military power will fall on Ukraine and potentially Poland and Lithuania. Because if they think they're going to be treated with immunity, that's not going to work. If they go into Ukraine, their countries are, let's put it this way, it will be open season on them for the Russians. Well, first of all, the Russians don't want Western Ukraine. They don't want to annex areas that are fundamentally Ukrainian. They've never made that statement. They've always wanted to avoid that. They're not fools. They know that that's sort of like putting a poison apple in your basket and then subsequently trying to eat it. They're not interested in that. I think if you sat down with them, they would tell you that what they have right now, which is historically Russian, and is where the Russian population largely lives, they're going to retain. The question is, what do you do with Odessa and what do you do with Kyiv? I think Odessa is going to be a tough one because terrible things were done to Russian citizens in Odessa in 2014, as you know. But even more important, Odessa has been used over the last year, plus as a point from which you could unload weapons and equipment for the Ukrainian military from empty ships that then picked up grain and went to sea. The Russians said no more, and they will not tolerate any control by the United States and its allies of anything in the Black Sea. So if we go into the Black Sea with any ships from the US Navy or Royal Navy, which I think would be lunacy, frankly, they'll sink them without hesitation. So now I think that's the real conundrum. You hold what you've got, and then the question is, what happens with Kyiv and Odessa? There could be some inventive solutions applied to Odessa that it's fully demilitarized. It sort of ends up in a status very similar to Danzig as a free city. Who knows? Kyiv's another question. Maybe the Russians don't want it simply because they say, well, even though it was Russian-speaking, they may not really want the bill for rebuilding it. I don't know. We don't know until you sit down and talk with the Russians. But on the Ukrainian side, whatever remains of Ukraine has to be neutral. There's no question about that. There can be no NATO presence east of the Polish border. Anyone who tries to establish that will end up at war with Russia. That's clear.